Hi, I'm Jared Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. So much of design is organized around typologies: the residential building, the commercial building, the park, the street, the poster, the book. We have these preconceived forms or mediums or templates that we use when we are designing. But as soon as you attach something to a typology, I'm designing a book, for example, or I'm designing a streetscape, you immediately give it a set of conditions. And perhaps in so doing, you also limit what you can make. You limit what is possible. My guest today is Walter Hood. Walter does a lot of things. He's a landscape architect, an artist, an urbanist, an educator, a writer. But in all of this work, I think he's playing with these typologies, making us unsee them, subverting them, distorting them. Walter is the creative director and founder of Hood Design Studio in Oakland, California, and the former chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of Blues and Jazz Landscapes, Urban Diaries, and the co-editor of the book Black Landscapes Matter. His practice, as you can imagine, is one that moves between disciplines, moves between typologies. So I was interested in talking to Walter about this multidisciplinary practice. We begin this conversation talking about why he refers to Hood Design Studio as a cultural practice as opposed to a social practice, and what that means before talking about this idea of landscape and how treating landscape as a medium is a lens to explore the range in his own practice. On the back half, we talk about his background and entry into landscape architecture and how that connects to his recent painting practice, and perhaps how that practice then is changing how he works within the studio. To close, we talk about how the ideas embedded in his work can be seeds for the next generation to pick up and take into new places. Walter's practice is a model for me, a model for how to move seamlessly between disciplines, but also a model for how to bring your own interests, your own background, your own experiences into the work, regardless of the type. I found this conversation so energizing. If you like the show and what we do here, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that's free for everybody, but we also have a paid tier that gives you a bonus interview each month and helps keep this show free for everybody all the time. I've said this many times. I want this show to feel like a great conversation in a coffee shop that you're listening into. And so really for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can help us do this work and put more of these conversations out into the world. I thank you so much for your support and for helping us get to do this show. Walter Hood, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jared. It's a pleasure to be here and be speaking with you.
I've heard you refer to Hood Design Studio, the practice you started in 1992, as a cultural practice. And I've heard you refer to this term cultural practice as somehow different or opposed to or adjacent to this more common idea of like a social practice. I'm wondering if you could talk about what you mean when you say cultural practice. What does that mean to you? How does that shape what the studio does and how the studio operates?
Well, it's a very using the term cultural practice is very idiosyncratic because it can be critiqued. I was in a workshop a few years ago where there's like, culture doesn't exist anymore. So it's like, how can you use that term? And for me, it's really a preamble to I'm interested in places and the people who inhabit a place, but how they actually are part of that place. And so I was taken by, working in the kind of the context of social practice in the art space, where I was noticing that me and fellow artists, we were going into places, working with communities, and then we were leaving. And those social engagements, they were just social engagements. They had very little to do with participating, right? In kind of digging deeper into the consciousness of a place and then being able to talk about it, live it, attribute to it, critique it. And it just became a larger sort of silo that suggests that I'm really interested in people. I'm interested in the place that they live.
Yeah.
And it's ironic that when I go give lectures, people always say, well, Walter's interested in people, and I'm in an environmental design role. And so
Right.
why wouldn't I be? And so in a way, it helps to sort of double down on, yes, I'm interested in people, but I'm also interested in that place in which you constantly keep protecting, making, destroying. And and I found that over my 30-year career, every place, and again, I don't like that term place because of place making and all of that,
That was what my next question was
right,
going to be. Yeah.
but every space or every context in which we work, there's always something there, and it's always something that's different than the previous context. And that's where I'm constantly pushing the studio to recognize that. And it's really hard because we're almost learning that in the US, all Black history is the same.
Hmm.
All, all Native history is the same. And we kind of like treat people as these large diaphanous sort of groups that, we can just sort of almost come up with a set of tropes that define their lifestyle, define their context, and then we just keep doubling down on that.
Tell me about your distaste for the word placemaking. I mean, what I'm
Yeah.
hearing from your answer is that this idea of making a place kind of suggests that there's not a place there
It suggests
already.
there's nothing there. There's
Yeah.
nothing there. And, I'm always taken by, we forget that if I visit, if I go on vacation somewhere and I'm there more than 2 weeks, I become that place.
Mm.
I become part of
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
society or that context. And you start adapting, norms. And it doesn't take long because again, the air, the light, the people, all of these things contribute to that. And I think it's almost um, dishonest to go into an environment and go, let's make a place, because you're literally saying people who are there already, they're not contributing to anything positive or
Right.
anything
Right.
of success,
Right.
right? And it's almost like a slap in the face to people who inhabit. And I think in a lot of impoverished neighborhoods, the thing that I'm more intrigued by is, why don't we validate that people have been in these places?
Hmm.
Because they're, in a way, the hardiest. We have the most to learn from, people who are in these marginalized circumstances. We do it with plants and animals. We go, oh my God, these plants were able to survive in this crazy,
Right.
context, and they're strong, but we don't do the same thing with people, right?
That's so
And so
interesting. Yeah.
and so we constantly are looking for ways in which to talk about, articulate people's existence in a place in a positive way versus, oh, poor soul, they don't know where their food comes from, so they need a community garden. That kind of
Yeah.
paternalistic, kind of
Yeah.
attitude from being up here.
I've heard you talk about how your projects, you don't start with a program, you don't start with kind of design decisions necessarily. You start with understanding that culture, that history, that heritage, the what the place is and what that has been. How how does that change? I'm trying not to use the word process here, but I'm curious, like, how does that change the process when you start there as opposed to here's what this should be, or here's the place we are going to make, or maybe even more foundationally, how does that change design decisions that come out because of that research? Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah. I mean, and it took me a while to get there, because in the beginning, you get a project and it's like, we need a park. Here's how much money we need, these things, and you immediately go and you do it, and then you come and look and you go like, well, I didn't really move the needle, right?
Right.
And so I started questioning, well, maybe a park, we shouldn't do a park. Maybe, a streetscape. Well, maybe we shouldn't do a streetscape.
Hmm. Hmm.
Maybe we should um, paint the doors. And just beginning to just look at a place closer, you start to see that the bureaucracy of design, particularly in the context of the civic landscape, of the civic context, is, there's a bureaucracy for it, and we
Hmm.
used to have like parks departments. We make parks, we maintain parks, we keep parks. We don't think of anything other than the park. And we've gotten sort of stuck in this, particularly in urban design and landscape architecture. And architecture, we've gotten stuck in these typologies.
Mm,
where we know they don't have the power to try to do the transformations we want, but we don't have ways in which to suggest that maybe we need to pivot. And I, part of my writing and part of my teaching, I typologies have always been interesting to me. It's, and particularly from a colonial and post-colonial
yeah,
point of
yeah,
view, that how, particularly in landscape, how did we get stuck with the park, the plaza, the square, and just the street, and we don't have other ways to talk about these landscapes? So if I don't say streetscape, if I
right,
just said street landscape, I would almost think about it differently, because the scape is everything I see, right? And so I'm
right,
looking at it from a purely visual point of view. And so that's why you get the same trees on both sides of the street, the garbage cans all match, because we're
yeah,
talking about that, versus
yeah,
when, if I say the street landscape, a project we were doing in Berkeley, I was like, okay, we're in a floodplain. We're in the floodplain of a creek. What if I designed the street as if it was an epidermis of my skin and it could absorb water and da, da, da. So I just asked a different question,
mm-hmm,
which the hard part then becomes, the bureaucracy is like, oh, we can't do that, because the bureaucracy doesn't have the tools to even understand it.
right,
You know what I
right,
mean? It's like,
right,
you're talking, that must be art you're talking about, or that they just want to put it in a different silo. But it allows us to interrogate and to hopefully change those positions of those bureaucracies.
right.
Sometimes we were able to do it, but I would say 80% of the time it's really, really tough, because the structure, the infrastructure is set up to deliver those typologies. If that makes
It does. And I want to come back. I want to come back to this idea of typologies for a second and the structures of those. And I want to hold on this broader term landscape for a second, actually, because I think it's interesting as I've been thinking about talking to you. Your work spans, and your practice over your career has spanned architecture, art, public art, painting, urbanism, landscape. For me, if I can
yeah.
give that a term, feels like the center of the Venn diagram of all of these. It's the linchpin that connects all of these, but it's also the one that is the hardest to define what that is, because a landscape can be anything. How do you think about, I'm going to ask you a broad question first and then a specific question. How do you think about that term landscape? What does that actually mean to you in your work? And then maybe the second part is, what can landscapes do, or designing landscapes or working with landscapes do, that these other typologies that you work in, architecture, urbanism, art, maybe can't do?
Well, I mean, again, very difficult question. I mean, I started
Welcome,
out,
welcome to the show.
yeah, I started out studying landscape architecture. So, really that definition was pretty much the environment around us that we can see, that we inhabit.
Mm,
And that's pretty much, I was taking on that very narrow vocational kind of view. And more recently, I've gotten more interested in thinking in WJT to work on, landscape, the medium. I've been more interested in
mm.
deconstructing and thinking about landscape more as a medium,
Oh, I
right?
love that. Yeah.
And the medium that, and I've always kind of said this in studios, like in landscape architects, like, we don't have much, guys. I tell them in the studio, we got trees, we got some dirt, we might have some shrubs, we got some paving and some benches and light. That's all we have. But then when you start thinking about the medium, though, we forget that, the ground is the medium. And
Mm,
so if I think of the ground, water is a medium that we use. Plants is a medium that we use. Light is a medium that we
mm,
use. And all of those things, if you can objectify them in a certain way, then currently I can just see things a lot clearer then, because, I love California because of the light. And
mhm.
it blows my mind how, making landscape here, people don't really think of light. And,
Right.
and so again, it gets you into these places where you can see the landscape in a very clear and acute way, and you can shape the medium then,
Hmm.
versus trying to design the landscape, which is really hard to do, because everybody is participating in this thing and everybody thinks they can do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? I mean, everybody's like, "Oh, you're a landscape architect. I have this backyard." You know what I mean? So it immediately becomes this thing. But if I look at it as a medium, I'm in all of these amazing conversations. Like, even in my studio with my landscape architects, they hate that I objectify plants. It's like, oh, we got to do native plants. I'm like, I'm just interested in the prickly one. I'm just interested in the one that does this kinds of things. And so it allows for a different conversation around how you make environments, but it's freed me up in a way to at least use the medium to approach the work in different contexts. And sometimes, you can use all of the mediums, and sometimes you only need one or two of them.
Yeah.
And I relate it to painting. The medium of painting. You introduce something into the paint that makes it shine more. Or it's
Hmm.
that thing in between that allows me to work in a way, or to rework something that's very familiar to someone that
Yeah.
I can take to another place.
I'm wondering if I think I think that's really well said, and it's making me think about a bunch of different directions we can take this. But I'm wondering if that's what makes landscape such a ripe medium to explore culture in a way that maybe architecture cannot, or a building cannot, in insofar as a landscape is something that sort of is there. It
Mhm.
exists. There are these
Yep.
layers of it, where a building is something that has been built at one time, and so you can kind of see a beginning of it. And
Right.
then that openness, that the fact that everybody thinks they can do it and everyone can kind of come in and out. Does that resonate with you, that that's
Oh yeah.
somehow
Oh
that is a medium to explore these cultural ideas that you are interested in a way that designing a building maybe can't?
yeah. Yes and no. I mean, I think those same mediums I'm talking about have an impact on architecture,
Right, right.
right? But I think a lot of times we don't allow. I think good architects understand landscape and the medium, like light, like Luke
Mm,
Kahn
right,
understood
right,
light.
right.
And again, you can kind of see how those relationships begin to sort of play together, and how you get this kind of collapsing, right, of these
Hmm.
disciplines at certain points when people are more interested in the medium of environment, which
Hmm.
is coming out of landscape. And I think people like Barragan,
Yeah.
and even some projects of Le Corbusier. I was just in Marseille, and I was just blown away by the Marseille block. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
but you start to kind of see that, again, I can look at these buildings as these artifices, but they do something to the landscape.
Yeah.
And like at the Marseille block, Corb gave the Mediterranean to these people in a way that I've never seen architecture, give this to kind of a general public. I
Yeah.
mean, you sit on that roof and it's like, oh my God, they have the Mediterranean, they got the ocean and the mountains, in the cross section,
Yeah.
right? And so again, there's that moment where you go, this is about landscape, right? All of a sudden, I'm
Yes.
taken away from the artifice, and that's one of the things I love about architecture, landscape, urbanism, and art is when you get those moments where there's a collapse of those disciplinary boundaries that happen. There is an understanding of culture.
Yeah.
There's an understanding of that environment that you're in, and so it's not a one or the other. And I think that's why I have so many degrees. I mean, that's why I left landscape, because I thought it wasn't rigorous enough
Mm.
to get at this kind of theory, to get at this kind of making. And I find architecture was rigorous, but again, when I was in architecture school, no one was talking about landscape other than one professor. No
Right.
one was talking about how to bring these things in. And so then when I got out, it's like, how do I do both? And then again, the bureaucracy, the infrastructure to do both, it was like, oh, okay, this is not working.
Right.
And that's where the art thing then allowed there to be this kind of reconceptualization of those disciplines in a way that I can now just focus on the medium
Yeah.
and the context without saying it's architecture, it's art, right? It's
Yes.
sculpture. And
Yes.
of course, people want to say that. They want to go like, oh, that's art. That's
Yes.
this. And I'm like,
Yes.
no, it's just design.
Yes. That's exactly what I was thinking about when you were talking about landscape typologies earlier. It's like as soon as you say a park, there's an image of a park. As soon as you say a street, you know what that is, a plaza, a garden. And that your work is trying to blur those. What if it's not a street? What if it's not a garden? What if it's not a park? What else could a park be? but your practice itself is also blurring typologies. What is the boundary of landscape architecture to public art to
Yeah.
urbanism? And so it sounds like you don't think about those boundaries anymore. Those are less interesting to you in
Yeah,
some
they're
way.
less interesting to me, but they're still there because even like I was discussing this with my partner yesterday, Alma de Solier, and she's a landscape architect, trained as an architect as well, but she was saying, she keeps saying, I'm not an artist. I'm like, that's fine. You can say that. I'm not, you should not take on and be in my cloak. This is
Yeah.
my cloak. That's what creates this tension in that, I've developed a way that I don't want to be siloed. And I know others really want to work in that way. And I think it's okay.
Hmm.
I don't think it's one size fits all. I mean, I think that's what
Yeah.
makes these collaborations really wonderful is these opposing ways in which we situate ourselves in the work. But I'm hoping it brings a more rigorous critique, right? And collaboration when we're clear about the things that we want to do, right?
Right.
With the tools that we have. And that to me is my bigger thing is just being clear and articulate where you're coming from versus being ambiguous, but also being holier than thou in your ambiguity,
Right.
right? That
Right.
this is the way we have to do it.
Right. I, in an interview for Architectural Digest a couple years ago, you said something similar to this, and you said, "In each discipline, I started to see the limitations of that field, so I needed to find more." That's the sense that you were pushing up against the edges of each of these. Can you articulate for me what those limitations were that you were pushing up against? Like, you talked about the rigor of architecture, the lack of rigor in landscape, the culture of landscape, the lack of culture in architecture. How do you sort of articulate that thing you're searching for across all of this kind of body of work that you've built now?
Well, let me put it first that we all come out of our own generational context, our own epoch, right? So
Yeah.
I'm of a different time, but a couple things, I come from a very strong disciplinary upbringing. My father was in the army, in the
Mm,
service, first person to go to college. So there's always pushing that rock up the hill.
hmm. Hmm.
Um, and when I got in some context, there was like no one was pushing the rock, and I was like, why aren't we pushing the freaking rock? And and that was when I talk about rigor. I'm just talking about this notion of just being overly passionate, but also interested in making and
Hmm. Hmm.
in doing. And I've always I just look for those places, and sometimes those places I found myself in, they were just less rigorous in that way.
Mm,
And then the other part of it, but the more challenging part of it was, as an African American man, you know, in this in these professions, I was trying to find myself,
right.
and I remember very early when I met my first Black landscape architect. He worked for the National Park Service, and I was like, "Wow, who's this guy?" He worked in California. He came to our
Right.
school, and then I followed his career later. And then I met two others, and I was like, "Yeah, those are the kinds I want to be." One was a kind of a researcher, and one was a more professional. And then
Mm,
I found that that was kind of it. There was no more, and I was just like, "Okay,
yeah.
how do I talk about myself in the work?" And there just wasn't any examples of that,
Yeah.
right? Until I started looking in other professions, and
Hmm.
I started seeing
Mm,
how writers, how musicians, how fashion designers, actor, I mean, people bring
yeah.
themselves to the work. And
Yeah.
it just was a long time before I felt comfortable in being able to find that space in which I could uh, talk about myself through the work. And it took me a long time to realize that I'm a Southerner. It's like
Right.
I left the South and gone other ways, but I the work is storytelling. And a lot of the stuff,
Yeah.
is really coming out of those early years of living in the South and being raised by my grandmother and being out in the country in Lillington and all of these places. And I had like pushed that stuff all the way down, right? I mean,
Hmm.
to be in New York to talk, more intelligent, to be in
Yeah.
Philly and go to California, I mean,
Yep.
and to
Yep.
like be present in those places, I had to like, I felt like I was leaving a lot of that stuff behind. And when I then started thinking about history and culture and all of the work, I then realized that I was very familiar with it,
Mm.
right? I was very familiar with the narratives and stories people, particularly brown and black people, were telling me about their circumstance and their context, that I then had to figure out how to use the work then to for it to be present, right? And I
Yeah.
think the aesthetics, the process, all of that. Today, I feel more comfortable when I look at the work. I see myself in it. Not every two projects are the same. That's my brain. It's like it's very schizophrenic. That's just me. Small attention. I
Yeah.
can't stay
I
in
get
one
it. No,
place
I
too
get it,
long.
man. Yeah.
And so it's all of those things, coming together. And as we were talking earlier, it's like I I I want to do everything. And I remember one of my professors, Pat O'Brien, bless her heart, one day she came up to me. She goes, "You just want to do every fucking thing." And that kind of stayed with me in the back of my
Yeah.
brain. It's like, yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, why can't I do the art? Why can't I do the build? Why can't I do these things? And why do I limit myself? Why limit yourself if you have that passion?
Yeah. I love that. And I want to stay in this space of kind of like where you come from and how that shapes the work. I want to go back to the 70s for a second. You're a
Mhm.
sophomore at North Carolina A&T,
Yeah.
HBCU. You're getting a degree in architecture engineering.
Yep.
That's a technical degree. I've heard you talk about how you didn't see the engineering part when you register for that. But your second year there, your sophomore year there, a landscape architecture program is launched, and you see this guest speaker who's a landscape architect, and you've talked about how they presented these beautiful watercolors, and you were
Yeah.
just so drawn to that work, and it felt like that was giving you something that this architectural engineering degree, the work you were doing so far, was not. What what was it about landscape architecture? What was it about these watercolors that pulled you in some way, even without what we were just talking about, this awareness of yourself in the work, this idea of culture? There was something there from the beginning that grabbed you. What was that? What did that look like?
I mean, my memory is, I think it was Paul Friedberg or someone
Mm.
of that sort. They were just, they were probably markers and color pencil drawings. They were loose,
Yeah.
uh, but he was talking about people, and he was
Mm.
talking about public space, and he was talking about joy to a certain degree. There were playgrounds and fountains, and it was just this
Mm.
thing of like, wow, he's really talking about this thing I had never heard that people did this thing, right? Because I had taken drafting in high school where we were like making
Right.
buildings and
Right.
architectural engineering, but no one had said, wow, I had gone to Freedom Park in Charlotte, I had gone to the great, the Smoky Mountains and places, but someone designed that. And so that was one part of it. And the other part of it, it was new. And
Mm.
Dr. Charles Fountain, who unbeknownst to me had gone to Berkeley and had made Ball State, he was like one of the first Black landscape architects who brought this program there. And he was a very interesting man who kind of took me under his wing, and he saw something in me that I didn't see, but he challenged me to a certain degree. And that was another thing that no one had done before, right?
Yeah.
This kind of like personally challenging me.
Yeah.
And and it just felt like this new place. It felt like this new adventure to go on to. And I thought that was like it, because by my junior year, I went in co-op in the Blue Ridge Parkway for the National Park Service. They offered me a job after school. I had this degree. I went to DC. I was working for the National Capital Planning Commission. I was like, I've made it. I've done it. And that was kind of that introduction, but then finding out that it wasn't just pretty pictures. It wasn't all about, happy joy. It
Yeah.
was like the 80s in DC, man. My God, it's like the late 80s. It's
Yeah.
like crack,
Yeah. Yeah.
bad playgrounds. I was like, okay, now I am not improving people's lives, making these things. And so it was that adventure, but then it was the same adventure that got me out to Berkeley,
Right.
thinking that I needed to understand the profession more in terms of theory, in terms of
Mm,
history, because there was an acknowledgement that even though I had these skills, I had gone to an agriculture and technical school, which
hmm
is developed through the lens of Booker T, which was more about skill building and a little less about liberal arts. And so, literally, when I went to Berkeley, I created my own liberal arts education, and that was this point where theory became a big thing after working with Garrett Ekbo, who was like this preeminent landscape architect, but spending days talking with him about kind of the social aspect of landscape architecture and how design was
hmm
the tool and not planning. That was like that moment where it was
Right.
like it's okay then to be this crazy creative and still talk about these ideas, where
Yeah.
none of my professors were actually buying that shit. I mean, it was
Right.
like,
Right.
it was interesting that I was like doing this research with an emeritus, guy who people had thought was getting old and, losing it to a certain degree, but he was like feeding me this great stuff. And I was like, okay, man. So,
I mean, the reason I asked you about those watercolors and that trajectory, and maybe you're starting to answer this already, is because I'm thinking about this idea of like how do you bring the you
mm,
into your work? And I was thinking about your book Black Landscapes Matter that you co-edited, came out a couple years ago. And you write in the introduction to that book, Black landscapes matter because they are prophetic. They tell the truth of the struggles and the victories of African Americans in North America. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. These landscapes are the prophecy of America. They tell us our future. I'm wondering how you arrive at that book. Like, how do you need to bring the you into your work to be able to do a book like that? Is that there when you're seeing those watercolors? Like, can you see the seeds of those ideas
mm,
at North Carolina A&T, or is that something that came later? I want to like connect
yeah,
that
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
first impulse in landscape to this idea of the black landscape.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think they're married. I mean, they're
Yeah.
part of that diaspora for me, going from this HBCU, which is a very protected, very insular place where everyone looked like me.
Mm,
We spoke the same language. I mean, it was like 5 years of incubating, which 20 years later, that sense of self never diminished. It
hmm
just, as I said, I had to like
Right. Right.
push it down a little bit. And that notion that this prophecy, and I still think about it, and like the neighborhood where my studio is, it's there is a working woman who is right outside my gate. She has a car, and we just bought this building 3 years ago, and she's there, and this landscape has probably been the same over the last 25 years. It's impoverished, low,
hmm
a lot of subsidized housing, a lot of nonprofits. That's the prophecy. It's like we're dying.
hmm
And if people don't see that, if you look at these places, I've seen like grandfathers on pedal bikes, over time. It's like
Yeah.
I used to
Yeah.
see grandfathers in hats and ties going to church. Now I see
Right.
grandfathers in starter jackets and pedal bikes. And that's the that's us. And you know there's not a lot of sustainability in that,
hmm
when you kind of think about it. And that's what I mean by that. It's not that there is this alternative thing, and it's almost like in these days and times today, it's like, don't don't worry about what you're looking at. You don't really see that.
Right.
This is what you really see,
Right.
and this is somehow we've fallen prey to that, even in the design field.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of, it's like stepping over a homeless person. That's the same kind of thing. But, if you just look, that's the prophecy, guys, that we allow this kind of non-empathetic way in which to coexist with our fellow people. But if we had to really say, okay, if this continues, the future looks like this,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? We would
Yeah.
act. We would act in a way, right? But somehow we've been anesthetized to a lot of these things that we see in the environment based on our history,
Yeah.
that we will overcome it to a certain degree, right? Through these tools. And
Right.
now the tool is, I just look at this freaking thing in my hand, so I don't have to right,
Yeah.
think about these other things. And that also is a prophecy to me, which I hate traveling now because I'm sitting in an
Right.
airport and I'm just watching everybody with their hand, looking at their hand.
Yeah.
And it's scary because everybody's looking at their hand. Um, and again, it's like it's no different than going out and people are living under the freeway.
Yeah.
you know. So I don't know if I'm answering that, but going back, to those early days, it's that just having that sense of understanding that collective. And yeah, I realized that 5 years in this environment, it produced me. What would that look like if you created these worlds out there
Yeah.
where there was this kind of these nutrients, this kind of richness, this caring, this thing that happened. And maybe we don't have to look the same, but we
Yeah.
had all of those attributes,
Yeah.
right? Where, collectively we could be part of something. And I think that's the thing that has always stayed with me. And to try to articulate that, visually, physically, it takes all the tools. And I know it doesn't come back to the watercolors, but that
Well,
notion that I have to figure out just different ways in which to bring people right together.
yes,
Uh,
that's exactly what I was thinking about, and I haven't fully articulated this
yeah,
before until you until you were answering that last question. But I think it's really easy to look around at the world today and think, well, what good is a garden going to do? What good
right.
in my field? What good is a piece of
Yeah,
graphic design going
yeah,
to do
yeah,
in the face of all of this?
yeah.
And it almost makes me wonder if that is part of your project in jumping between these disciplines, that some of it is a way for us to actually get outside of the discipline and see it in a new way and say there is value there. By going into the painting studio where we can see landscape in a different way and say, hey, this is doing something.
Yeah, yeah, and it allows you though to get that courage in different places, right? I mean,
Mm,
and that's the one other thing that people have like put these little things. Like one of my professors was like, yeah, it takes courage to do this work,
yeah.
and I didn't understand what he was meaning about courage. And uh, you go into place, it takes courage to for you to speak your truth,
Hmm.
because people who even look like me look at me sometimes like, dude, who the hell are you? What are you talking about? But it's one of those things where I do think there is power in developing spaces in which people get to see themselves differently,
Mm,
right?
hmm.
And this is
Hmm.
the thing that, again, we don't do very well. I'm interested in getting people in a space where they look at themselves and go, wow, I, I'm supposed to be here, or I look different here. One
Yeah.
of my
Yeah.
first projects in downtown Oakland, one of my professors went there and was like, came back and he was like, Walter, you know, the space that you design is full of homeless people. And I'm like, okay, they're transients, they're not really homeless. He's like, but they look like normal people. And I'm like, what do you
Uh,
mean? He goes, you design the space you designed for them, they look like average people. And I was like, well, isn't that what design's supposed to do?
right.
But design actually does the opposite in many places. When we look at the downtrodden, the marginalized, we design for them in a very different way. So
Right.
let's take, I'm doing low income housing. Once I say it's low income,
Right.
then okay, the windows have no thickness. I give them the same thing. And of course, they then look like low income people. But what if I said, okay, I'm going to design for this group and they're going to look like they're going to church on Sunday, right? I mean, that's a different backdrop then. And so again, if we take on again these challenges of trying to put people in these spaces, so we change their sociology, one, right? We get them to actually start being in a different way. Maybe they used to walk this way, but now all of a sudden I got them walking this way
Yeah.
so that they get
Yeah.
sun on their faces every now and then. and they're not always in the dark. I mean, so again, just changing those little patterns and practices, to me, that's the thing that you can give people,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's graphics, whether it's, an industrial design piece, whether it's a piece of architecture, whether it's a
Yeah.
landscape.
Yeah. I mean, what strikes me about all of this, and I don't mean to keep making this personal to you, but that the ideas that you are embedding in your practice, you are also an embodiment of. And so I have a kind of personal question first before I bring this back up to the practice. I'm curious how, you've been painting for years. You've staged a couple solo exhibitions of your paintings in the last couple years. I've heard you talk recently about how you want to spend more time in the studio, more time painting. How has that type of work changed your landscape architect? Are you a different landscape architect now because of the paintings? And maybe this goes back to the watercolors too. Like, are
Yeah.
you a different painter because of the lands? Like, are you able to see yourself in different ways because you are jumping between these different places?
Yes and no. I mean, I've always drawn. That's always been the thing. I've
Hmm.
always kept a sketchbook. The year when I was in Rome, I must have like made 10,000 watercolors or something. I mean, I've
Yeah.
always drawn, done watercolors. The painting is a little different in that it's it's really putting myself in a space that's not familiar to me,
Mm.
that I have to learn again,
Hmm.
right? So that it's it's the challenge. It's the thing that I've noticed in my life, that I have to constantly put these new challenges in
Yeah.
front of
Yeah.
myself to allow my brain to stay open
Right.
when I'm doing
Right.
design work, if that
Right.
makes sense. That
Yeah.
that the writing, I hate writing, but I do it anyway. But I hate writing, but the painting I love. But it just helps that part of my brain. So when I go back to the work, there's an openness and a curiosity that's still there,
Yeah.
that I can't
Yeah.
find that medicine for the curiosity in the context of the work, if that makes sense.
That does. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, like, if I spend a night in the painting studio, I'm still thinking about design stuff,
Right.
because painting sometimes is very anal and meditative, right?
Hmm.
At least the way I'm painting.
Hmm.
I'm doing underpaintings, and so I'm doing this a very methodical way of making art. And so I don't know, and I hate to, I don't want to put anything on top of it, but it's very personal, it's very therapeutic,
Yeah.
um, but it's also something very new and challenging, and like, I remember a lot 2 years ago when I put on the show, walking into that gallery, it's the most I've been afraid,
Yeah.
you know what I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
those jitters in years, and it was something about it that was frightening, but also rejuvenating.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, not knowing, I don't know if they're good.
Right.
I
Right.
did sell a few of them, but I mean, there's not that same, right, that
Yeah.
same, um, I don't know yet. Like in some of the other design stuff, it's like, yeah, I did a really good job on that, right? But
Yeah.
here it's like,
Yeah.
I'm still in that, in the
I know what you
murkiness
mean.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
I completely know what you're talking about. That makes a lot of sense. I want to, if there's a theme to this conversation, however unintentional, it's something about bureaucracy, about borders, about the pressures to stay in your lane and the desire not to. And on sort of parallel to all of this other work that we've been talking about, you've also been a teacher. You've been in academia, which is perhaps the most bureaucratic system that there is. You were the chair of the landscape architecture department at UC Berkeley for many years. How do you encourage your students, or how do these ideas about multiplicity, about having different identities, about not staying in your lane, about breaking typologies, how do those filter into the classroom, or how do you encourage students to do the types of things that we're talking about here?
Well, first have to say, Berkeley as a institution, I owe my entire career, pretty much to Berkeley because, going through tenure at Berkeley was, pretty rigorous, and I
Yeah.
had really supportive people, but it really allowed me to formulate how I wanted to practice. And
Mm,
so I would say a lot of the practice ideas come out of teaching. And I had really good, professors, particularly, in architecture that I emulated, whether it was Dan Solomon, who had this amazing practice, has this amazing practice in San Francisco, but he was also teacher, practitioner, writer, who
hmm
did all of these things. And I was like, wow, that's a great model in that, I can use the classroom as a way to talk about these ideas that maybe aren't prevalent in the profession. And so I would say, if you ask probably any of my students over the last 25 years, every studio I taught, I never taught the same studio twice.
Oh, wow.
Right. And so I literally,
That's a lot of work.
every lot of work and every project, was things that I was interested in.
Yeah.
So, students work every place from, thinking about world without freeways to, I
Mhm.
mean, thinking about how do you plant a million trees and I mean, so just really taking on those kinds of ideas that were very important in the cultural context of their education, and those were the kinds of projects we were tackling in the studio. And then on top of that, there's always these theoretical positions that I held,
Right.
and they would change from year to year.
Right. Right.
One year I was, really into, like, Stephen Hole was talking about enmeshed landscapes at one time. And I was just like, oh my God, I love this idea. So I did a whole thing on enmeshing, there was the hybridity. And so
Yeah.
it allowed me to really think about these ideas, these theoretical ideas, right? And how do you then test them? And so the students
Mm,
were, literally part of that embodiment of testing those ideas. And so I would say my pedagogical framework was not that kind of, I was never part of the new urbanists. I was never
yeah.
part of the
Yeah.
landscape urbanism people, just always, those things that I thought interested me and this kind of urban work. I wanted the students to be part of that. The other part of it that I really impress upon students is rigor. And, a lot of them, don't always think that that's, a great thing. A
Yeah.
lot of them stay away from Walter. He makes you work too hard. But this thing that I always impressed upon students is rigor, and, not to just talk about the work, but figure out ways in which to get your ideas out there and
Yeah.
to experiment in different ways. And so again, teaching them, just different ways of making, different ways of seeing, and then trying to create environments where they can be critical of one another.
Mm,
That's probably the hardest. That's
yeah.
over time, as you probably know, in academia, that's a part that I think is lacking even more in our
Yeah.
inability to be critical of one another. And particularly within these spaces that we have now, whether they're digital spaces or whether they're real spaces, I find the students shy away from this idea of critique,
Mhm.
where everything, oh, nice drawings, nice
Right.
drawings. I was like, no, they're not.
Well, okay,
you
so
know,
yeah, so this
Okay.
this I have a great. You're speaking my language. Like now, now I got to like really think about how I'm going to ask these questions. Oh, because I was listening to an interview with you to prepare for this. This interview was from a few years ago, and you said something to the effect of when you study a discipline, whether that's architecture, landscape architecture, what that study does is it beats the you out of you. That was the phrase you used. And that really resonated with me as somebody who went through a design program that felt that is now teaching, trying to figure out how to not do
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
And I find that to be the biggest challenge is how do you not beat the you out of you? How do you how do you make a space for students to bring all of themselves? And this is what this whole conversation has been about also in your work, while also making a space for critique and rigor. How do those how do you think about how those feed each other? Um, the I'm bringing myself, my background, my interests, while also we're going to make a space where we can talk about this honestly and figure out how to make all of that stuff
yeah,
better. How do
yeah.
you do that?
Well, it's hard because it takes discipline, you
Yeah.
know, from the instructor and the student. And this is where I've probably not as been as successful as I would like to be with the students.
Mm.
Is to getting them to see the discipline that's needed.
Mm.
I think people want it now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I always use my analogy when I used to run track, that the coach, I just remember going out for track and never saw the coach the first 4 weeks. I just saw there was just a sheet of paper on the wall, like 440s,
Right.
288, and
Right.
that's all was there. And you just went and you just did that. And
Yeah.
then, the first practice, he was like, okay, get out here and run the quarter and have the whistle. He goes, okay, you didn't practice. There's just no
Yeah.
discipline. And that notion that when I'm coming to study something, then okay, I'm studying landscape. These are the things that I need to learn. Okay, I used to be a chef. Okay, but first I got to learn these new tools before I can cook these great things that I want to do because I'm cooking with these new tools.
Right. Right.
And people want to immediately start cooking.
Yeah.
And I keep saying, no, you need to develop these tools. And that's the part that there's a big disconnect.
Yeah.
Like people go, oh yeah, Walter, you can just give a lecture. It's like, how long, if I give a lecture, how much time I have to spend to put the lecture together?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
go, oh, you just do it. I'm like, no,
Yeah.
it takes a kind of a discipline,
Yeah.
right? Like when I used to start school, it was like I could not. August was like just gone. I had to prepare for September.
Yep.
And
Yep.
people just didn't realize, like, you're not going on vacation. It's like, no, school starts in a month. Oh, but you've been teaching for 20 years. Like, no, there's a
Yeah.
kind of a discipline. It's like
Yeah.
training camp,
Well,
right?
if you taught the same studio multiple times, maybe you could have taken a vacation in August.
But it's this notion that, it's like there is a discipline
Yeah.
that goes into every part of that in order for you then to have the tools in which you can then pull these other things in because you're trying to see them through a different lens.
Yeah.
And this is what happens is that when you don't have the discipline, then you you can't create that rigor. You then just you
I
do
think that's
something, you
right.
don't know what to do then. It's like
Yeah.
you're just sitting there going, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
But once you have that discipline, you can, it's like you can just do it. Like literally yesterday, I'm talking to one of my people in my studio, and I'm like, we need to make 3 quick perspective drawings. They're like, oh, well, I can go take it and put it into Rhino, and then I'll give it to you tomorrow. I'm like, I need it now. and and I just sat there and just did 3 perspectives scaled in like an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And I'm watching them look at me like, how is he doing this? And they never have taken the time
Right.
and taught themselves these very simple ways of seeing. And I don't mean that everyone needs to be analog, but through that discipline of learning these
Yeah.
things that I can just, I don't even think about it anymore because it's there. And that's the part that I find that the tools are now more dominant
Right.
than people having the discipline to use the tools.
Right.
Right?
It's not actually about the tools. It's about how you think. It's about how you understand the thing in front of you. And then the tool doesn't matter. You use whatever tool's available,
Yeah.
in that moment. We started this conversation talking about culture and a cultural practice. And I want to end going back to
Oh, we're
culture.
coming to the end, man. My God.
I mean, hey, if you have nothing to go, I could keep going. uh, I I love that you just brought up your studio again because I'm thinking about this idea of culture and how you create culture within the studio too. So much of this conversation is about you figuring out what you have to say and how do you say it and how do you bring your interests and background and heritage into the work and you're talking about how it's in all the projects even though the projects look different.
Yeah.
You are there. How do you create, or how are you thinking about creating a studio environment? You have, how many employees do you have now?
19.
So, okay, so you almost have, almost two
Almost
dozen
20.
employees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Almost 20 of us. Yeah.
Where all 19 of them feel empowered to bring, to be able to see themselves in the work also. How do you think about that? Or how do you do that at a studio level?
It's tough because there are so many interests. If you have 20 people, there's just
Right.
broad interest. But one thing I can say, all of us, right now I have my first partner. She is Alma Dussolier. She's from Mexico, but she's an American citizen. She lives here in San Francisco, but she's the first partner that I'm bringing
Mm,
in. So all of a sudden, it's not just Hood Design Studio.
right.
And we've having this conversation yesterday, and I have my first art director.
Okay.
Just named her. She'll be announced in the next 6 months or so, Sarita. But that's a big thing for me. That all of a sudden, you know, she's worked with me on enough of the art projects in which I trust her to a certain degree. And we were talking yesterday that a lot of the art now is Walter's art, but we also have a practice of art in which the work there are, how can I say, there are more artful things in the work that
Right. I know
she
what you mean.
can, right, that she can now go into any project now and say, well, we've been interested in these things, and so maybe we'll develop them in these projects. And so
Mm.
that's another way to
Oh,
see,
interesting. Yeah.
the projects. The other is, I stepped down from teaching this past year,
Right.
and I want to teach more in the studio. And so
Mm.
we were talking about, again, possibly a couple times a month there will be this small atelier in the studio in which
Mm.
we develop ways of working that brings in like the kind of a diversity of voices into the projects, and to see what that is going to look like, because I think there's a foundation now of making where we have industrial designers in the studio. We have
Mm.
graphic designers. We have artists. We have architects. We have landscape architects. And so we have a diverse cast right now. We have a space that just makes. And so hopefully we have a new space that we're
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
And so hopefully all of those things can begin to kind of create that next generation of work.
Yeah.
Because I would say that first generation is literally coming out of my interest in things like that. And as long as we keep getting the right projects, and right now, like on Lincoln Center, we're working in Lincoln Center,
Right.
and we're doing landscape and we're doing art, and we've used the cultural practice as a way to kind of think about making in a different way. Everything from industrial design,
Hmm.
right, to public art, to landscape, all of
Yeah.
those things are
Yeah.
getting threaded now, and that'll be interesting how that manifests itself.
My my last question is sort of the opposite of what I just asked you, because I want to go back to yourself for a second. And you talk about how the first generation of the studio in many ways were the things you were interested in. What are you interested in right now? Where does all this go next for you? What that could be ideas. What are the ideas? What are the kind of cultural ideas? But also, what are the mediums, the modes, the venues for this work? Where do you see this all going next?
Well, a couple of books are coming out
Oh,
for
great.
2028. One is going to be kind of an anthology of the studio, that first generation of
Okay.
work. And then there's another one called Hybrid Landscapes that's coming
Right.
out through UVA Press, which is more theoretical. And it's really talking about linguistics, post-colonialism,
Mm,
all of these, a lot of the things we're talking about, typologies,
yeah,
and maybe how to get around these things and how to
that's great.
create a new vocabulary for the kind of work. The other part of it is, I don't know, it's like I would like to continue working in these diverse communities that we're working in. But one of the things that I'm hoping for the future is that there is a more equitable distribution of capital that can find themselves in the places that need them to most the
Mm-hmm.
most.
Mm-hmm.
We're working in Portland with the 1823 group up there, where they just got some big funding from Nike to create, this new environment on the east side of Portland,
Mm.
which is, I think going to be really, really great. We're working in Florida right now in Overtown, a town that was trapped by freeways, and they're literally
Oh, wow.
saying, we want to, we want to
Yeah.
do something audacious. And I'm like, we're in Miami, man,
Yeah,
cultural practice, right? I
yeah.
mean, right? We can do
Yeah,
something,
yeah.
we can meet it head on. And so those kinds of projects excite me. The Lincoln Center project, the west side of Lincoln Center, you know, it's of a different visibility.
Yeah.
This is the west side of people who were kept out. And I'm really excited to see how this
Yeah.
project is,
Yeah.
because it's one of the first ones I've worked on, that really goes back and trying to, really recreate something that should have been created, right? I mean, through
Right.
a lens of not just empathy, but a lens of, yeah, they are part of the city as well, and let's bring
Yeah.
them in. So
Yeah.
there's a lot on the horizon, and I'm working on a new painting show
Oh, great.
that who knows where it's going to be, but I'm working on that. So there's a lot of things to be excited by in the future.
Yeah, I don't know how you do it all. You mentioned earlier how you would kind of see these models, these people, and you're like, oh, that's, I want to be like that kind of person.
Yeah.
And I think the work that you've done has created new types of models. You're a model for me in the way you think about your work, and the diversity of your work is something that I really admire. And I know I'm not alone in that. This was such an honor. I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so
No,
much.
that was great, Jared. You're very gracious and very open to allowing this conversation to sprawl.
Yeah, that's what we do here. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Jared. It's a pleasure.
That was my conversation with Walter Hood. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. This show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.